The thumb up must mean, in the universal language, that I may begin. That means I will hit the thing that says it's a show. Look how different it is now. It's a show. This is, I'm sure you are all relieved, the last of the four talks by me. I will try to make it through the talk. As I was saying during a break, anytime a person attends a talk in a language that is their second language, two things happen. One is that the talk seems like it's going fast, and then of course there's also this odd bias that the American takes advantage of by going to the international conference. The American is always able to answer questions quickly, makes all the Americans seem like they're very intelligent. But this will be a bit quick, but my excuse for that is that, I mean, I'm not here that often, although someone here seems to plan trips left and right. And so I will at some point be pointing at research findings and won't be able to recreate precisely what happened off the top of my head in that study, which is what you're supposed to be able to do when giving a talk. But if I did that, I would have been up all night, and then if I described the methods, I wouldn't get to them. So I'm trying to point at some point at a range of applications. So under the assumption that you've seen one or more of the previous talks, now all you need to do seeing no questions. And of course, Walt addressed this issue already, and so I will describe what we tend to do. This was implicit in the original one or two Kappa Model papers. The first one is back in 1997, but was spelled out by myself and two colleagues in this paper in this American journal. I'm not going to go through, and thank kindly, Professor Scott actually did go through some of that, so that saves me some intellectual activity here. I'll simply describe the assessment procedure rather than the logic behind the procedure, precisely because Walt already described the logic behind the procedure. Oh, I forgot I have a point here. We devised an assessment procedure. There are aspects of the assessment procedure that are perhaps arbitrary. If you ask me, does this thing have to follow the other thing, or could it come first? The answer is that it was arbitrary. The arbitrary has worked, so we have not done parametric variations of the arbitrary thing that's working. So aspects of this have to be there, and other aspects were I guess I said arbitrary. The feature is, the central descriptive feature is that the assessment method is ideographic. That's sort of a complex word. The fact that there's the same procedure for each person means it's not ideographic. Ideographic, of course, meaning a graphic or a portrait that's sensitive to idiosyncrasy. But there are multiple features of the assessment procedure that are much more sensitive to idiosyncrasy than most other procedures other than an interview. So if you imagine, well, there's no time for an interview, but we have to do something and want to learn about the person, not about our own variables, this was our best guess. So the three steps here are, the first one, using the logic discussed in the previous talk. Well, if people have some schemas, if you ask them to talk about themselves, whatever they say, it's likely to reveal that schematic knowledge. I mean, that's, of course, what one thinks when conducting an interview. And so the methods are straightforward. We begin with that rationale which I just said, and then straightforwardly ask people this question. The question, in case any of you were to run studies like this yourself, which of course is the entire point of these 2 days, seriously, as that'll be my last slide, is that you can't just ask people to describe themselves, because you will learn that the person is 22 years old and, lifts weights or something. You have to ask a question that is kind of like this. You also have to ask a question that's kind of like this. So, of course, there were some participants we had to throw away Because if you ask in the United States, anyway, people to describe themselves, they describe much more frequently than not, I believe more frequently than other nations, they describe personal strengths of theirs, and it seems like everybody's just wonderful. So the technique in all of the Kappa model studies has been to ask people about personal qualities that they see as strengths and personal qualities that they see as weaknesses. In particular domain applications, the questions are changed. If the domain is, for example, people are smokers trying to quit smoking, the question will ask people to describe their personal strengths that are relevant to the challenge of quitting smoking. If the study is a study of people trying to get good grades in college, it might ask to describe your personal weaknesses as they relate to this domain of academics or college life in general. In other words, little tweaks are done to simply avoid getting extraneous information. Again, that's the sort of thing that would be implicit. It's reasonable to have in mind the contrast case of an interview. The interviewer, if you sat down with a college counselor, it's pretty unlikely that you talk about, your skills in woodworking, unless you were majoring in woodworking. You would talk about things that were relevant to the world of college. There's a second step, which is that people might write a number of things, and they do. And when we run studies, and the original ones are just college students showing up for one of those little studies in intro psychology where they get credit, surprisingly, they write lots of things. There's something about, at least in the US, asking people to describe themselves instead of giving them a standard questionnaire that's more interesting to people, and at least 2/3 or 3/4 of the people write somewhat interesting, complex stuff, as you'll see. Sometimes people say, I am shy, and move on, but it's much more common that people write something about themselves, and then they might write enough about themselves that some of it is relatively extraneous, so we ask people to reflect on what they've written and to indicate when the studies were done on paper, to circle the most important features. Obviously, there's software that runs all this online if you want to run it online. And people say things like this. It's a regular person. This must have been one of the first 20 or 30 people in the first study. The person says things like this. Got good public relations skills. So this is immediately the feature that may not map onto a typical personality trait. There's another long story that there's not time for, and it's another one that's relevant to Walter Mischel. When you ask people to describe themselves, they do not routinely list personality traits. That's just a story that's told in the personality trait literature. People, of course, say things that could be classified with respect to traits, but they commonly say things that have one of two qualities. Either they're contextualized, good public relations skills, or they're not any one of the traits. I have a good sense of humor. That's not really any of the traits in the Big Five model. Or a person might say, I'm shy. When I'm around people immediately contextualize stuff. I don't know, it's crazy. I can speak publicly just fine, but I'm still shy. I'm afraid when I get in trouble with authorities. People immediately contextualize things. Though those two statements are from the same person. The person who had good public relations skills is shy. That happens a lot. In a sense, the initial finding. People frequently report things that are semantically inconsistent. I'm a hard and diligent worker. I care deeply for others and go out of my way to help those in need, often putting their issues ahead of my own. I'm honest, will tell the people closest to me the truth. I'm strong, have proven this quality to myself, independent, but willing to ask for help when I need it. I'm a pushover and get forced into doing other people's work for them. Overly sensitive. I blow small issues out of proportion. I'm lazy. I keep in the house rather than being with other people. I'm a flake. I cancel last-minute plans because I no longer desire to get dressed. I talk too much, and oftentimes over the person I'm having a conversation with. I'm insecure, so the person is diligent, lazy, strong, insecure, self-critical, independent, a pushover, cares for others, and just cancel plans with other people. Who cares? These are actual people. I'm funny, but very serious. I have a welcoming personality that greets people with a smile, a joke, a hug, and I'm mean. I hardly seem to find fault in people who I may not agree with, but when meeting a person, I'll quickly judge them to see if they're worth talking to. I'm determined. hardworking, and lack willpower. I'm responsible and procrastinate for everything. I'm a hardworking procrastinator. If any job is given to me, I can and will accomplish it, although I leave things for the last minute and tend to be lazy sometimes. I know how to get along with people. I'm kind, caring, have a short temper, and get mad very easily. Irritated at little things. Note implication for the additional trait strategy. If the person is given 10 personality trait items in the domain, and you average them up, the person will get a score in the middle. The person who answers every item in the middle will also get a score in the middle. That means people who have huge amounts of variation with respect to a personality trait and who have no variation with respect to the personality trait get the same score. Yet the personality trait strategy is quite popular. Then there's a second part. Learning that the person says they're shy, as you already can tell from the person's self-descriptions, would not allow you to predict much about how they appraise situations, because who knows how they appraise situations? The question outlined conceptually in the first talk was, how does the person relate this quality to the everyday situations of their lives? Which means you need to assess something about the relevant situations. There's a background logic here, which I rarely even have a chance to talk about, which is that some questions that you could ask people are simply too hard. If the person says, I'm shy, or I'm irritable, or whatever it is, and you then ask the person, well, what situations is it relevant to? You're handing the person a task that cognitively is terribly difficult. You're implicitly asking them to scan over 50 circumstances of everyday life, and then when they are done scanning over those, to identify the 5 or 6 that are most relevant. And then you're asking them to do something that obviously exceeds the capacity of working memory. People can't answer that kind of question. So what we do instead is to take our best guess at a set of items that is reasonably comprehensive. This is easy in applications. If the application is the challenges of being a first-year college student, it's straightforward to identify 20 or 30 types of circumstances that are challenging to the student. If the application is a clinical one and the person is trying to deal with an addictive disorder, it's straightforward to identify the situations that are relevant to the addictive disorder. This is challenging if you want to do it in general, but in a kind of ironic cheating, it is possible to take the semantics of the items that are the 5-factor model, to sort of situate them. Do you get anxious when you meet strangers in a social setting? And to assume that at least the item set in the 5-factor model will capture a wide variety of potential activities and tendencies that people express. So that was the kind of cheat. We had no expectation of recovering the 5-factor model, and don't even care if we do, because that's a model of how people differ, and this, of course, is an attempt to study individuals. So what we did is, to avoid asking people to do the impossibly difficult task of thinking of the situations, we created something. This, I'm sorry to say it, even in slightly immodesty, but thanks to me, this is the actual novel part of the Kappa model method. The part that's a good idea that we happen to stumble upon and that accounts for all the variance that would be lost in a trait study is this. The logic here is that even though people might not be able to remember all the situations of life, they'll recognize the situations in which, oh yeah, come to think of it, that is relevant to me being a hard worker. So what we do is to develop a set of everyday situations. Participate in a classroom discussion. Remember your friend's birthday and say happy birthday to them. Cheer up a friend who's depressed. Study for an exam even when your friends are out at a party. There's like 100 of these. As displayed here by what's now a faculty member at the New School for Social Research, playing the role of a student, Samuel Weiner. The participant for each personality quality they identified as being relevant to themselves, is given a set of situations and is asked to sort the situations as being ones in which shyness comes into play. Well, if you were confronted with this situation, would your shyness be relevant to this? Note, for 4 out of 5 situations, for most people, the answer is no, because it's something like, solve a math problem. Right? It's irrelevant that I'm shy, I'm just sitting there solving a math problem. But the person subjectively judges the relevance of the situations, and all the action that's fun from the Kappa model empirically is coming from this. I don't know, there's another, I don't know what the point of that picture was. There's the experimenter. The experimenter is she left the University of Lausanne, but is still in Lausanne, Switzerland, Marina Fiore, and a motions researcher. I don't know what's going on there. Sam Weiner again, he asked me to put him on screen a lot. Okay, good. He went down with that. So now here's the kind of thing that happens. One of these two people was the person whose narrative was up. This person, this happens to have literally been participant 5 and 6 in the original study. Participant 5 said, I'm shy. How does this express itself? Well, I'm a smart person, but I would never be able to, this is one of the items, give the definition of a large word that other people don't know the definition of. Because I'm too shy, I wouldn't want to embarrass them and make a show of myself. Participate in class discussions. Shyness, discuss feelings of embarrassment with a friend. Make plans for a date. Somebody else, shyness. Keep a conversation going on a trip. If I spill drink, remain calm. Remain calm and composed in a class presentation. Note, this is what the arrows mean. None of the 3 situations seen as shy by participant 6 were seen as relevant to shyness by participant 5. And none of the 4 situations seen as relevant to shyness by participant 5 were even seen as relevant to shyness by participant 6. So if you just hand out a regular shyness inventory, there are items in there that are relevant to shyness, and then there's like 20 other ones that for that person are just a waste of time. This is the sort of thing that happens. This participant says they work well independently, they're perfectionistic and responsible. Where does the responsibility show up? If they spend too much money on, shoes, they'll return them to a store. If there's a friend who's depressed, it's their responsibility to cheer them up. If they know there's somebody smart in class and that they might, this essentially is the item phrased more concisely, miss a lot of classes, they'll make friends just so they can borrow the person's lecture notes later, which is an item actually added from a Machiavellianism scale. But that's just a responsible behavior. I'm paying all this tuition. And the item, if you're lost in a course, speak with the professor, was seen as, person didn't see it as even relevant to responsibility, even though that seems like the prototype item. Here's somebody who, sorry about the foul language in English, says that they can have a good time naturally and is crabby and bitchy. This is the sort of superficial consistency that you get all the time, but it's not really inconsistent. The person says they have a good time when they're in crowds of people. They entertain people with jokes. They can be themselves in a group of friends. They can cheer up. That's not literally they can. It's relevant to this quality. If they're in a train that gets stuck, the behavior cheering up other commuters is relevant to this quality. But if they're driving or their boyfriend is driving or people aren't working or somebody criticizes them, then they're crabby. So it's clear, it's no mystery to it. These are situations where the person is sort of disagreeable. These are situations where the person is extroverted and agreeable. And you suddenly get kind of a sensible portrait of a person very quickly by using the Kappa model methods. Other things happen. Here are 2 people who said that they're independent. The meaning of the English language word independent was not the same for the 2 people. One of them meant the sort of thing you might think of first if you're an American English speaker, like defend yourself if others criticize you. But the other person meant things like avoid being late for classes, be sort of Machiavellian, get a friend to run an errand for you. I mean, that's not irrelevant to independent, but it's not the same thing as defend yourself if criticized by your professor. So that's the idea. The sorting task picks up lots of information that in a million personality studies before it was just noise. Other people have done some things kind of like this. There are other idiographic methods in the history of personality psychology. Why? None of them look, to my knowledge, I would have seen by now, none of them look exactly like this with the subjective ratings of the situations, but there are other people who tried to do things that were idiographic. Then finally, in most of the studies, we ask, that's why I'm here today, we ask self-efficacy appraisals. It would be fun to run studies in which we also followed people for 2 months of time, and they reported 3 times a day on each of their activities and their feelings during those activities. And if somebody had a few $100,000 of grants, we could be off and doing that. But in addition to the intrinsic interest in self-efficacy beliefs, which of course are intrinsically interesting since you have a different psychological life if you have low self-efficacy beliefs for things you care about, no matter what you're doing. It's also the case, and I haven't said this in this room, and I probably should have. There are multiple domains where the singularly best predictor of what people do and how well they do it are self-efficacy beliefs. And I'm not just saying that because I'm the editor of Al Bandura's social cognitive theory. There are multiple domains where the objective review says, oh, and the best predictor of how the students did in math was their self-efficacy beliefs for math. Oh, the best predictor of whether people avoided relapse for smoking was self-efficacy beliefs for avoiding relapse for smoking. So in a sense, we're using the self-efficacy literature and its predictions of behavior that are already established in an uncountable number of studies as background, you know, in a kind of a logical, almost mathematical way. That problem is solved. Everybody already knows that the self-efficacy beliefs are causally influential and predict behavior. What's not solved is this other problem. Why does the person have these self-efficacy beliefs in the first place, and why are they the same in these situations and different in the other ones? The self-efficacy items are always, as they should be, contextualized. So they're like this. If your boyfriend seems to be interested in another woman and is bothering you, directly face up to the issue by explaining to him that you feel hurt by his attention. If you're at a party where you don't know most of the other people, entertain a big crowd of people by telling jokes or stories. If your boss is harshly I guess you can read this without me doing it, but in case the screen isn't working at home, I'll just keep reading. Your boss is harshly criticizing you at work. Can you, of course, that's the actual item. How confident are you that you can make a pleasant self-deprecating joke to lighten up the situation? If you're in a class that has a weekly discussion section, actively participate in the discussion by making at least 3 or 4 comments in class every week. So if you go back to the original Bandura studies, this is what the items are like. Imagine you're in a room in which there is a snake and you are wearing a glove. Can you touch the snake? So it's the same kind of contextualization. Of course, all the scales are standard 0 to 100 point self-efficacy scales. But now there's a prediction. The prediction follows from everything that was in the previous talk. The prediction is that the person will have subsets of situations that are an equivalence class because they're, oh, me and my low self-control situation, or my intelligence will work out for me situation. Even if they're not literally saying that to themselves, in the same way you're not literally saying to yourself, that chair is a piece of furniture. It's nonetheless the case that situations have multiple components. They can be interpreted different ways, and for a bunch of situations there might be enough noise in the system, enough different components, that you then, the categorizations reveal something about the individual schemas and drive consistency across situations and self-efficacy. And if that's the case, it's certainly better than handing out a generalized self-efficacy scale, which even if it works, gives you no information about why any of the beliefs generalized in the first place. I'll put up an example, the first one, that will have self-efficacy scores on the top. So these are 5 items that are all in the domain of what they would call agreeable behaviors, or, in the brilliant intellectual move of trait psychology, manifestations of agreeableness. I would offer to save money on a date. I certainly wouldn't criticize the other person. I'd be gracious to my partner's parents. I'd resolve tension in a relationship. I explain concerns without hurting my partner's feelings. Both participants saw each of those 5 situations as relevant to their personal strength. So they indicated their personal strength. They said, these are the 5 situations relevant to my personal strength. And these assessments are done on separate days to avoid priming effects, literally cognitive priming. And then they came in a week later, and they filled out a self-efficacy scale. I'm sorry, it's on a 10-point scale. Or I guess it's 11 counting 0, not a 100-point scale. They were near ceiling on the scale. Warning, this may be the highlight of the talk. One person said their personal qualities that they're nice, and the other person said they're able to manipulate people. That's all a strategy. I'm great, I'll make believe I'm willing to save money on a date, and then I'll do all these things because I'm manipulative. This will happen in these studies. People will explicitly tell you, I can manipulate people, it's great fun. And of course, the point is that without that last step, the people look the same. And that is what's happening with the Kappa model. In a sense, the talk could stop here, but it won't. But the Kappa model is saying that the scores on top may equate people who differ. That's the spirit of the bottom-up strategy, finding out that people do something without finding out why they do it, their reasons for doing it, why they can't do it. It's not really finding out about persons. And then lots of other similar things happen. I haven't done this as much, but if you want to identify groups of people who are similar, one step, though it's insufficient, is to run a cluster analysis of the self-efficacy scores. And so we did that a bit, and these 2 people were in a similar cluster. They were in a similar place of z-scores on these items. But the test item, I could remain calm when doing a class presentation, for one person reflected the fact that they're well-educated and hardworking, and the other person, rather than being so goal-oriented, is easygoing, but socially skilled. So in both cases, the person has a reasonably high level of self-efficacy, but in one because they did a lot of work to get there, and the other because they feel like temperament-wise, they're just easygoing. And so they're different people who end up in the same place. There's some technical term for this, but I always forget if it's multifinality or equifinality. But there's more than one way to get to the same place. Okay, so one could do that forever and ever, but of course the point is that there should be some lawful patterns occurring. There's a broad kind of spirit here that the way to identify lawful patterns is, I'll keep picking on the generalized self-efficacy scale, is not by identifying a construct that is a general lawful pattern, but by dealing with things one at a time, by dealing with cases. I'll say it, in case anybody's in a different field, I don't know, sociology or anthropology, it's the American anthropologist Clifford Geertz, in the study of human behavior, who most clearly spelled this out. The way to learn what people are doing is to study lots of details, and then lots of details with the next person, and then lots of more details, and then draw some conclusions about what's happening. So the spirit of this is exactly like that. The Kappa model studies essentially are very miniature case studies for 100 people. But at one point, it'd be nice if something lawful happened. So what we do, and note that the study works, of course, otherwise I would not have been invited. But what we're doing is exactly what was in those abstract circles and lines pictures in the previous talk. for each person, we're saying, oh, these are the cluster of situations where their personal weakness is coming into play. These are the cluster of situations where their personal strength is coming into play. And we're identifying for that person their level of self-efficacy in these situations and those situations. There would be a study if there were only one participant. That's the fun part of the Kappa model. And of course, as you see from Walt's extensions to the world of clinical assessment, where you are interested in one person, the logic at least then plays over. But it would be nice if in general something happened, and in general something happens. And so if you do this, where you're reorganizing the data for each person, and if we're lucky and anybody does this, there's already a bunch of R code in case you want that detail. What you're essentially doing is using a set of relevance ratings from the sorting task as a vector of scores, and then you're dropping the relevance ratings on top of the self-efficacy items. And the vector of scores that's the relevance ratings are pulling out the high and the low relevance situations, and then you're grouping those together and creating this graph. Except I didn't have the R code at first and was doing everything by hand. But now we can save a month of time. We have the R code to do it. And what one finds, it's pretty easy to identify the thing that was hard to identify when, in talk number 1, Walter Mischel was trying to review the cross-situational consistency studies. They always failed. This, I'll say it, always works. I know of no one who's run one of these Kappa model studies and then told me, oh, it didn't work. This worked so robustly that in the original report, there were only 25 participants. I believe I could randomly sample, I'll make up a number, a dozen participants out of the thing, and it would work for every dozen participants. It almost works for every participant. Works means that people have a much higher sense of self-efficacy in those subsets of situations, and I'll explain what most important trait means, in those subsets of situations that they subjectively see as those situations in which their personal strength comes into play, and not in the situations where their personal weakness comes into play. Most important trait, thank heavens I included the Hazel-Marcus study 45 minutes ago, is the Hazel-Marcus study procedure in which people rate personality traits as being important to them rather than indicating them in free response. In both cases, those are supposed to be schema measures. And in case you're wondering about the good question, and we're about to ask it, but now you can't, if you hand people randomly selected words, you pull a word out of a hat, essentially that's what we do, and say, sociability. Which situations are relevant to sociability? Which situations are irrelevant to sociability? And see if the system works. It doesn't work. It only works for the schematic traits. So the conceptual model is the person already has a self-schema. I'm independent. I can't control my impulses, whatever it is. The concept is that they're essentially interpreting the test item. The test item now is a complex stimulus they're interpreting, not just a survey item. And then if you ask them to make the ratings of self-efficacy with respect to these items that are relevant, sorry, this is such a long sentence, but these items are relevant to something. They're relevant to friendliness or sociability or reliability, terms that are in the personality literature, but the person does not say are relevant to me, then the study doesn't work. So you have to go to the effort of doing this idiographic, one at a time, identification of central personality strengths and weaknesses. I'm happy to report this has been replicated in numerous studies. So now is the part of the talk, oops, when did the talk actually start? On the half hour, where I'll try to speed up. So here's, for example, a set of applications involve resisting the urge to smoke. In that circumstance, one creates a set of situations in which the person might fail to resist the urge to smoke. When I'm by myself feeling depressed. When I'm with a bunch of other people feeling happy. When I've just had 2 drinks. Right after dinner, there's a set of these. These are the the pertinent situations are already identified by smoking researchers who run lots of qualitative studies about risk of relapse situations. Oh, sorry. Here they were now. It's the ones I just said. So the idea then, I'm sorry, you don't even need that, but the idea is that for each person, the person then has some strengths and weaknesses, in this case with regard to the challenge of not relapsing and starting smoking again. And if you can identify the situations, and they're all the same with the studies, one after another, which we do using the same sorting task that you saw depicted by two people, except at this point, maybe sooner or later the studies become, they're on a Qualtrics on a computer rather than with pieces of paper. One finds this sort of thing. The person will say, I have strong willpower. Here 3 people said they have strong willpower. But note, they linked strong willpower to different situations. So I'll avoid smoking when arguing with a friend. I'll avoid smoking when spending quality time with my family. I'll avoid smoking when relaxing after eating a favorite meal. So what we're doing is, even if there's some homogeneity, which there is in this domain, a lot of people say willpower, you still find that there's individual differences in this sorting task that saves the day for all these studies. And then what happens is that these are raw numbers, not z-scores. So there's, I'm sorry I don't remember, 9-point scale or a 7-point scale, with 0 being I can do it, and we're predicting large-scale variations. Oh, I would not be able to avoid smoking. Oh yeah, I would be able to avoid smoking. I would not be able to avoid smoking. I would be able to avoid smoking within person. Obviously the contrast is you could give somebody an avoid smoking self-efficacy scale, but most of the action is occurring within, which is exactly what Walt said in a different application. It's occurring within person across situations, so you might as well run an assessment that's sensitive to within person across situations. Oh yes, this is a fine point detail. There are certain situations that are so important to the person that they'll say that their strength and their weakness relate to it. I'm a shy, intelligent person, and class discussion participation is the item. Well, it's relevant to my personal strength of intelligence. It's relevant to my personal weakness of shyness. So in some sense, it's surprising that these studies worked in the first place, these and others, because those were coded such that there was noise. The weakness situations sometimes also were subjective strength situations. But if you pull out the subset of situations, so it's like that. Some people relate, the situation is important, they relate multiple personality qualities of theirs to the same situation. If you pull those out, the thing, it works even better. So that if you identify, this is going back, I'm sorry, which page? Oh, that's good. This is going back to the original Kappa Model studies with the diverse array of interpersonal behaviors in a paper with Heather Oram, who's at the University of, what they now call the University of Buffalo, after 50 years of calling it the State University of New York at Buffalo. So they'll change it to Buffalo University. Sorry, hope you're not listening, Dr. Oram. If you do that, then these are really large-scale results. The variations in self-efficacy are pretty robust. People are shifting a couple of points on, you know, a 9 or 10-point scale. It's not that subtle thing where you need 1 million participants to eke out the fact that changing a half point on the scale is statistically significant. We're identifying situations that people think they can't handle, situations people think they can handle, and we're picking up the enormous within-person variability. Now I'll do the rest quickly. This is a study that was rather tricky to run. Thank heavens I was working with somebody who was able to run it. I would have messed it up. The idea from the previous talk was that there may be priming, so the schema will come to mind or not. So we've run a study in which we do the Kappa Model assessments. We learn about schematic strengths and weaknesses. A week later, the person comes back for a self-efficacy assessment. A week after that, the person comes back for another self-efficacy assessment. At the beginning of the sessions 2 and 3, they do something like the Torrey-Higgins experiment that was on screen an hour ago. They engage in some kind of memory test in which now the memory test has to be made up individually for each participant. So if the individual participant says, oh, I'm unreliable, then in the weakness condition, the memory test has 10 words, 4 or 5 of which are synonyms of reliability. And if the person says that their personal strength is that they have a good sense of humor, 4 or 5 of the words is synonymous with sense of humor, and that's, if you combine the 2 sessions together, you replicate the basic Kappa model, finding, predicting levels of self-efficacy. But, and there's 2 parts to this, people, and I will say I've never seen a study like this before, except maybe some of you have seen it before in 2019. People's responses on the self-efficacy scale vary significantly as a function of priming. This is actually the most significant Kappa model result. This is the idea. When the person is given a self-efficacy scale, well, for a bunch of items, some idea will come to mind and they'll answer the question. Well, if different ideas come to mind, they'll answer the question differently. The knowledge structure is guiding the appraisal process. And note, that only happens in the subset of situations where they said, this is a convoluted, well, it's complex, it's not convoluted, complex set of things. The priming does not just put the person in a good mood. In other words, if in all cases the black bar went up, that would mean the priming just put people in a good mood and bias their judgments. But this finding only occurs in the subset of situations where the person said these attributes are relevant and helpful. So even in some cases, the person will have a weakness like I'm shy. The test item will be, you have to study for an exam instead of going to a party. And the person will say, oh, no problem. I'm shy, I can do that. If you identify those subsets of situations, they're affected by priming, but it has to be those subsets of situations. So it is, and I'm not taking credit for the guy, it's actually what exactly this Torrey-Higgins guy at Columbia University is predicting. But for some reason, because they're not personality psychologists, the social psychologists running those priming studies did not run this kind of study that was person-focused. They only historically ran studies that were process-focused to show the effect of priming. You can also predict, just like the Hazel-Marcus study, speed of appraisals. The concept is that if you're schematic for the thing, it should be immediately clear to you that you can do it. So we run a set of studies, I think these are with smokers, thank heavens there's so many studies I can't keep track of them, in which we time how long it takes people to respond to the test items. Why the self-efficacy literature historically? Why? Of course, we do know why. Because it works so well using self-report questionnaires. But aside, slight strangeness, is that the entire self-efficacy literature just uses self-report questionnaires rather than arrays of additional methods that are available to people. Obviously, historically, that was fine. You know, Bandura had no trouble predicting things with the scale, but there may be more to learn from additional measures, and so what happens, as I think I may have said with the Marcus study, you have to separate response times to yes and no items. It always takes longer to answer no. So if you look at the situations only in which the situations means the test items that people said yes, if they answer a question that on the right where the positive attribute is relevant to a situation and they say yes, occasionally they'll have an attribute, schematic attributes positive. Oh, I see, going down is faster. Thank God, I couldn't understand my own graph. So compared to the mean, they're faster, so the mean is lower, and so the graph goes down. They say yes particularly quickly. Yes, particularly quickly when they have a high sense of self-efficacy in the schema route. So they're saying yes over there too, but they're saying, I guess I can do it, as opposed to just saying yes, an indication that it's schema processed. There's more studies like this. Now we're in the domain where yes? Excellent, a question. Do you need a microphone?
Can we go back one slide, please? Yeah. So is there any relation or perhaps a threshold in which reaction times have been equated with that knowledge structure?
Yes, but I don't know what they are. So as a person knows that they're in cognitive science, there are two things going on here. One is that these reaction times are curiously long, curiously large variations compared to a normal reaction time study in cognitive science. So commonly reaction time studies, letters will appear. I don't know if this will answer your question, but at least it's my excuse for not being able to answer the question. Letters will appear and you'll have to indicate whether it's a word. This will not take very long. You'll press a button that says word. You're responding only to a word, and so the variations in reaction time to degraded words and non-words compared to real words, it's going to be 14 milliseconds. Here I'm putting up something where the variation is a half a second. We could have used a wristwatch to run the study. That's because people are responding to a whole sentence stem. So the sentence stem essentially says, for a while on screen, would you be capable of doing this, that, and this, if, and then the thing comes up. You had to participate in class discussion. So they actually have to read the sentence and then answer it. There's no other way we know of to run the study, because of course the person formulates the answer while reading the sentence. That's why the reaction times are so long. I hate to say it, that makes it impossible to address the threshold issues, because threshold issues with reaction times, which is great, I just can't figure out how to do it here, will answer questions like, was the person consciously aware of a stimulus? And a certain, if they respond, if a stimulus is on screen for X milliseconds and then it influences their response, it was sub-threshold. I can't answer any question like that because you have to have the semantics of the items on screen to run the study. Sorry for the non-answer, but we can edit that out of the video later. That was just kidding. I'll just do this quickly, even though we moved to a different domain from beliefs to standards and to other. So now I'm doing the pointing rather than the explaining. This is a study by Bill Shadle and a bunch of other people that uses reaction time methods to examine alternative evaluative standards. Note that I said in the Kappa model that those were minimally necessary but maybe not sufficient conditions. A standard thing to say that goes all the way back to Carl Rogers in the middle of the 20th century in American, frankly it probably goes back in some readings of the superego, is that some standards are things that you personally have set for standards for yourself, and others are things that other people think you should do. Ideally you would like to do them, you ought to do them. They may diverge. Bill Shadle and colleagues devised a task in which they ideographically identify for reasons for smoking, things you think you ought to do. My family thinks I ought to do this to be in better shape, things you would like to do, and is able to identify variations in reaction time as a function of smoking responses, self-efficacy responses, again, reaction time to answer the question as a function of schematic or aschematic items, and is able actually to run these analyses showing a really tight relationship between a separate measure of schematicity and reaction time after some numerical transformation that I can't recall. But if you have time to email Bill Shadle to get the answer to the question of what that was, I'll be able to answer any questions. He should be up by now. Bill Shadle runs priming manipulations. Sometimes there are behavioral measures in these studies. These aren't, I won't claim these are Kappa model studies, but this is Dr. Shadle using the general ideographic methods, which are essentially the same kind of things. In a craving study, a smoker is literally given a cigarette and asked to hold it without smoking it. It's kind of like a Michelle marshmallow test, where you're supposed to not eat the thing, and then if you identify the content of these cues, well, my family thinks I ought to do this, and then run a study in which you manipulate them through a priming manipulation. The priming manipulation is such that if you activate self-efficacy is lower if you remind people of attributes that are their smoker self. So what do you think of yourself as a smoker? Oh, I'm fun-loving, I'm loud and boisterous, I hang out with my friends. And if you remind people of that, they have a lower sense of self-efficacy than if you remind them that they also said, I'm a family man who cares about my friends and children. And so their self-efficacy varies as a function of activating different aspects of self, just like in a Hazel Marcus study. Other people have just thought of other things. Somebody I'd never heard of before, named James Wise, suddenly told me years ago that he published a paper called Testing a Theory That Explains How Self-Efficacy Beliefs Are Formed. Hooray for him. And did it in the context of recreational activities. Self-efficacy is frequently studied construct, but researchers, where did you get this idea? Have focused little attention on what in blazes is going on underneath the self-efficacy appraisals that might explain why they generalize. Hooray for the Kappa model. And I'm going to skip what he does, but in recreational activities, there are people who want to get more exercise. There's a whole thing of recreational studies, but some people don't do some activities. Oh, I might get hurt. It'll look embarrassing. I'm overweight, and I'll be hanging upside down from some gymnastics device. And they'll get self-efficacy ratings. But of course, people have within-person variation, and he'll be able to predict within-person variation in self-efficacy for recreational activities from the Kappa model methods. My colleague, who actually is the person who ran the smoking study that I'm sure I would not have been able to do myself with all the primes across weeks, Professor Tracy L. Caldwell at Dominican University, 8 or 9 miles west of UIC in Chicago, took up a different question. This is sort of the point. I must say that Dr. Caldwell was the first person who picked up on the point. Even outside of self-efficacy studies, there are lots of domains in which people use an individual difference construct to try to predict what people do in social situations. As we saw, hopefully there won't be anything else to point at, as we saw from the Walter Mischel reviews, those studies often fail miserably, like they predict, with correlations of 0.2, but they're nomothetic, lawful, same construct for everybody studies. Dr. Caldwell was interested in an interpersonal strategy of humor use. There is in American psychology a whole literature on humor use, which is potentially more interesting than it sounds. It was interesting to Freud. There may be different reasons for using humor. Defend the self, aggress against others, whatever. So she runs a study in which she uses there's a standard scale, nomothetic assessment, do you use humor to do this? Affiliate, do you use humor to do that? Aggress against people is the other. There are some standard dimensions. And then does the most straightforward thing. Why does nobody else do this? Just ask people, why do you use humor? They indicate anything. Then they have a schema about humor and interpersonal, and then she does the Kappa model kind of stuff to situations. And I'm just putting up the results for affiliation. If you ask people, do you use humor to affiliate with people, which situations are most relevant? The whole concept is so abstract, the psychologist's concept, affiliate with people. It doesn't work at all, but if you just ask people, why do you use humor? What's your underlying reason or motive, loosely speaking, and then run the Kappa model stuff, you can predict variations in humor use. Let's see, what are the other ones? There are other studies that sometimes use different methods that probably are in some ways superior. I've been analyzing data sets one at a time and combining them. I won't say superior, but at least complementary. Lisa de Blas is a personality and psychologist and psychometrician at the University of Trieste, who ran a Kappa model study using items, as I did, that were like Big Five items. I'll explain why cats were up on the screen. Sorry about the cats before we got there. And this is the knowledge appraisal relation. I'm sorry about this. Of course, once a person runs it with this hierarchically nested analysis like you're supposed to do, then instead of getting fun pictures of individual people, you get these numbers with asterisks. But in any case, you will note that there are asterisks next to the things that say schematic strength and schematic weakness. She runs essentially a conceptual replication, is able to psychometrically relate this to the individual differences scores, so it does relate to someone asking the question, is there some way of relating a Big Five model to this? Psychometrically, there is, of course. You could put numbers together. In any case, this is a case where you again replicate the standard thing in which the schematic strengths and weaknesses are predicting self-efficacy appraisals, and they're also predicting it specifically, well, in any case, in the schema relevant situations. Oh yes, now the cats. This was up briefly earlier. When I put up the picture, when was this? It was earlier in my trip to Brazil. It was probably at the end of the last talk, discussing top-down and bottom-up explanations for things. I introduced the term of, I used the term contextualized action tendencies. We're hoping everyone uses it because it has this great acronym, CATS. Yes, I know FEPSB is an excellent acronym too, but contextualized action tendencies is a convenient sound. What happens here is not a self-efficacy study. It's for reasons that are sort of a nuance. The dependent measure is, would you tend to do this behavior? It has to be, do you tend to do this behavior? Because if you comprehensively go across the Big Five, some of the items are preferences. Do you like this or do you like that? It does make sense to ask people their sense of self-efficacy for liking something. That's just in the domain of preferences. A lot of the Big Five items are, would you like to go to Las Vegas on a vacation? Why that's a good personality test item universally, I don't know, but that kind of thing is an actual item. So that's actually, I'll skip this. There's a logic. Nobody's going to use that. People have used other terms I've introduced, like bottom-up. Well, I didn't introduce that, did I? Like personality architecture. But action tendencies, there's a long literature, including in philosophy, of the implications of words and the understandings of actions. Hans Eysenck, who was an actual behaviorist while being a personality psychologist, liked to talk about habits as if everything was coming out of an animal learning lab. But what happens is we use these 30 contextualized action tendencies where they represent each of the facets of the five-factor model. So if you know this thing, each one is supposed to have 6 facets, and if you multiply the numbers, you get 30. And then we ask people to run the Kappa model methods, and here's the kind of thing that happens. People will tell you things like, I'm laid back. That's a natural thing people tell you, but it's not exactly clear what that means in the five-factor model. Maybe you could guess. But what happens is the person relates it to these situations. It's all sensible. Remain tolerant of others' lifestyles, avoid getting into arguments, remain calm and cool-headed at a time of stress, don't become angry. Everything makes perfect sense. It coheres. It's an obvious, straightforward person who doesn't become angry, is cool-headed, spends time just daydreaming. You can almost picture the person is tolerant of others' lifestyles. This is a coherent group of situations that consist of 2 extroversion situations, 2 openness to experience situations, and 2 agreeableness situations. The factors have no meaning at all at the level of the person. There is no trait there for that person. Here's somebody who's lazy. If they have a free weekend coming up, they plan high-energy events. Or they wouldn't because they're lazy. An extroversion item. They try some exotic food for dinner, or they wouldn't because they're so lazy. An openness item. They keep their personal belongings neat and well organized. Well, they don't because they're lazy. A conscientiousness item. The items hang together. It's a sensible person. The person just doesn't look anything like any of the 5-factor dimensions. Person after person, and then you can actually document this. If things worked ideally, the person would indicate a personality attribute and it would map to one big 5-factor. That happens every once in a while. Like 1 out of 10 people looks like the Big 5 model. But people, in some cases, will map, I should have had one up, a personality quality to items from each of the Big 5 that are supposed to have been independent, but for the person all hang together as an indication that they're anxious. They're so anxious that they can't do the extroverted behaviors, and they can't be agreeable, and their anxiety interferes with their reliability at work, and they won't try new foods, and everything just gets scrambled. But if you then predict what people self-report that they tend to do rather than a self-efficacy scale. You can still predict what people report that they tend to do, which was supposed to be what the personality literature is doing, but you can do it by working with their own personal beliefs, the schematic attributes, and simply throwing out the big 5 variables. And then there are, I started on the half hour, so I think I'm okay. There are 4 domains of application. I'll just point at them. And I will desperately hope that there actually are 4. Oh, this one I'll spend a few moments on. It's because there are some people interested in education. This is in the educational domain. If you imagine somebody sitting down with an advisor, sorry for such a stereotype where the advisor is a white man with long white hair. And a mustache. The advisor wants information in an interview that's person-focused. Well, what's this challenge for this person? What does it affect for that person? But, of course, the standard questionnaire doesn't give you that, usually. So we ran a study seeing at least what one learns about students using the Kappa model. The study was done with engineering students at the University of Illinois Chicago, not unlike Unicamp. There's a bunch of engineering students. And that's where we are. That's UIC, as Walt would recognize. And Chicago in the background. It's a large, diverse university. It's the same things. We run the same kind of study, but no, we're asking people to identify strengths and weaknesses that are pertinent to being an engineering student, because we don't really want to learn that they're good at throwing a frisbee. There's more to it. If you try to identify their self-efficacy, so there's a bunch of self-efficacy items that are all over the place. Do you think you can learn the technical material in a math class? Do you think you have skills in a laboratory? Can you establish a good relationship with professors? Can you establish a good relationship with other students? Do you think you can learn enough about career opportunities to advance your career? Do you think you can balance family life challenges with school? They aren't all academic. And of course, I say of course because it is the case that every one of these studies works this way. You can predict these variations in self-efficacy appraisal. But then you can pull off this little trick. This is the best thing since the participant who was able to manipulate people. Here are 5 people who all have the same, literally same score on an academic engineering. It's a contextualized engineering self-efficacy scale. They are all 0.5 standard deviations below the mean. And then, if you pull off, he's back, not Socrates, the Walter Mischel trick and run a profile analysis, the people look like this. There's one of them. There's another one. There's the third one. There's that one. There's that one over there. Even if you're handing out a semi-contextualized engineering self-efficacy scale, the scale is equating people who differ quite a bit from one another. Now, going back to a question from yesterday, yes, one could say that this is a functional analysis of behavior, and the thoughts are varying across the situations. However, once you say that, you're done if you're a behaviorist. Okay, we'll do a functional analysis, but we don't actually know why the person has this functionally different shape across the situations. I'm sorry, I'm being unfair to poor Professor Skinner who isn't here. But there's nothing to say except the kind of story, oh, they must have had a reinforcement history. But if one treats the situations not as stimuli, but as something the person has interpreted, then you can find out what they're thinking about the situations. So what's a particularly fun one is speaking up in class. So it's nice to be able to speak up in class. The professors know you. You make a good impression. This person can't speak up in class because they're lazy. They're so darn lazy, they aren't prepared enough to ask questions in class. They also have a low sense of self-efficacy, even though that's not here. This person can't, they have pockets of low self-efficacy that also include seeking out a mentor. They can't seek out a mentor because they're so lazy, they don't get themselves to talk to the mentor. This person can't speak up in class either. It's because he's the only black student in the engineering class. I don't believe I have his essay. He actually tells us, well, it's hard for me to speak up in class. I'm the only black student in class. There are stereotypes, and he essentially tells us, if you know this literature, there's stereotype threats. I know if I get up and say something that's wrong, I'm just confirming some stereotype about black students, and so the student doesn't speak up in class. In neither case is the person, in neither case is the person introverted, because speaking up in class would probably be an introversion item. That doesn't have anything to do with anything. In one case, the person isn't prepared to speak up in class. In the other case, they're the only black student. It's just too much of an effort. Second domain is actually a whole set of studies, and I'm just pointing by my colleague Daniele Artistico, who's at Baruch University in New York, as you might guess from his name and my being able to pronounce it in semi-fluent Italian. He's originally from Rome, who's used the Kappa model in studies of older adulthood. What the notion here is that in older adulthood, he's studying the domain of what they call everyday problem solving. Not playing chess, but solving problems like, oh, I have to get across town, I don't have a car, there's a snowstorm and a bus strike. How do I get there? The implication usually is for older adults that there's just a decline in what older adults are able to do. But if you identify, and there is for a bunch of other items like, your computer is broken, try to fix it. But if you identify subsets of situations that younger adults, middle-aged adults, and older adults all say are relevant to my personal strengths and weaknesses, I care about these, then it looks like nothing happened in the study, and that's the point. Then if the measure here is, let's make sure this is right, self-efficacy for problem solving, everybody has about the same self-efficacy for problem solving in their idiographically identified situations. Now I'll point at only 2, 3, 1 or 2 more things. I've lost track. This won't have data. Note, as I said already, we're in the middle of things. Feel free to jump in. Look, it's not Socrates. One way of thinking about the good is like Plato did. There's some good out there, and you have to figure out what it is and be good, because you can be good once you figure out the good, and then you talk about the good. The other is to think, I do not know this as well probably as people in this room, is to think a little more like Aristotle, whose work looks more like a psychologist, who believes that the good is to develop character as a person, and that's a skill. If the beginning of Aristotle's Ethics just talks first about skills. Well, the expert develops the skill, and then the expert is able to distinguish the good and the bad, the finely done, and then whatever. There's a whole world in the last, especially, I'm told, 10, 20 years, in which people, instead of doing other forms of moral psychology, which happen to be the ones, in part, that Bandura criticizes when talking about the moral domain, have picked up the idea that contemporary psychology might provide insight into the Aristotelian question. So the Aristotle question is, does the person even recognize, for example, that there's an ethical issue here? Well, we can trick the other company and put them out of business, and our company will thrive. We can kill these villagers, and then we'll take over their village and seize the land. But hopefully you will have paused to realize that maybe it's a bad thing to put the company out of business or kill the villagers or these other things. I'm sorry, I used such an extreme case. The recognition of the stuff of the domain is the Aristotelian story. Nancy Snow is a philosopher at the University of Oklahoma, where she actually runs a center that has some name like the Center for the Study of Flourishing, a very general kind of name that fits very well. It's a great name in case Professor Snow is ever watching this video. And then to my enormously pleasant surprise, Professor Snow says this: well, if we want to understand virtue, the idea is that you want to recognize that there's a good reason for acting here and relate a form of behavior that's good to an underlying idea. Well, how might you do that? Can't tell you how surprised I was when I got this in the mail. She suggests that certain aspects of the self-schema, conjoined with self-efficacy appraisals in certain domains, are essentially what Aristotle was talking about, and their development is part of the development of Aristotelian virtue, and suddenly decided that you could understand this, pardon me? Well, I didn't know if I missed a question. Using Yes, the Kappa model. And so now there's a bunch of papers by Nancy Snow using the Kappa model. The concept here is that, well, somebody might want to be a good father and then has a this is her text, self-schema is modified from the guy who hangs out with his friends to Sam, the loving father. And then self-efficacy appraisals, those relating to virtue. Oh, sorry, I keep pointing at my own screen. How's that working? Virtue-related encounters can enrich the self-schema. So essentially the person is trying for something, observes themselves, they're successful at some things. Oh, I'm taking care of my son. That feeds back into a change in schema. So she's imagining, of course I was too dimly in the background, that imagining some back and forth in which you, just like Al Van Door said, observe your behavior, see you can do something. If you see that repeatedly, you have a deeper change, not just in self-efficacy beliefs, and with all due respect, that may be the limitation. If you develop a bunch of new self-efficacy beliefs, you don't just have new self-efficacy beliefs. You have a broader sense of self where you really, this is a standard world of schemas where you extract from the situations and develop a broader belief. Oh, maybe I am a good father. Sam ponders more deeply what it is to be a good father, aided by his new experience. His conception of a good father and how a good father interacts deepens, and suddenly he looks like an Aristotelian virtue person. And the same thing is done by, almost simultaneously, frankly, a friend of mine, Anthony Ahrens, at American University in Washington, D.C., where he collaborates with a Catholic moral theologian at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. Yes, D.C., the capital, not D.C., the state of Walter Scott. And uses social cognitive theory as a way of accounting for the development of virtues. The concept here is that if virtuous action involves acting in the right way for the right reason in the right circumstance, the Aristotle concept, it can only be, and you want to assess it, gee, it might be that you want, I'm sorry to sound like I'm selling a used car, it might be the Kappa model assessments afford this possibility. For example, in one Kappa model assessment, Cervone, blah, blah, blah. Did I have to do everything as well? No, kindly and overstatedly said. And so then they work out that logic for assessment. Here's a completely, I believe there's two more domains. Completely different domain. In organizational behavior, you might want to assess leadership. You could do so by giving an individual difference of scale in leadership, or you could recognize that to be a leader, there are a distinct set of a half dozen sub-skills, and the person might have some and not others, and use a Kappa model framework for assessing the distinct skills, which has the advantage that then in leadership development, you can target the specific skill deficits. This Jeremy Muser, who's the lead person for this, has developed an entire program of leadership development that has individual assessments and a personal course of action, which in fact are the Kappa model assessments. And finally, because I got it in the mail this morning, my colleague at the University of Chichester has published 2 hours ago or something. I literally, Roberta got it yesterday, so we spent a bunch of time. I'm sorry. Where's the paper? I sent it. Where's the paper? I sent it. Oh, you sent it to Roberta. Sorry if you're listening at home, but I've got it now, and I'm going to have to switch over. Laura Ritchie is a professor of teaching and learning at the University of Chichester. She's also a world-class cellist and a well-known internationally musician. It's like there's two people, but they look the same, so it must just be the one person. She's recently published with her colleague Ben Sharp at Chichester, who's a cognitive neuroscientist who kindly participates in this research too, a validity study on self-efficacy, and she gets the same happy thing in which here's a bunch of people, two people, I'm sorry, who demonstrated the same strength and overall level of self-efficacy for the main tasks of their profession. But just like I put up, people in some cases look like that and that and that and that. I'm sorry because I just got this. I can't off the top of my head tell you what item 18 was. But if you draw the profile analysis, I'll do it again, just like Walter Michel said. As a display, you immediately see that the people with the same overall mean score are all over the map. So that's the end of my presenting things. At the end of this, you realized that you got tired of taking notes. and want to see things in one place, the best overview of this whole thing is a paper on page 0. I'm sorry, I think this must have been the pre-proof. But a paper in the European Journal of Personality is the broadest overview, to my pleasant, again, kind of surprise, and Walt, of course, Walt there has a paper in this too. There's a special issue on personality coherence, where the whole issue looks kind of like what I've been talking about, and that paper is the one that most fully executes the broadest Kappa model story. And I'll close by saying this, or asking this question. I'm sorry if this is too dramatic, and it's more like something Walt, and feel free to say the same thing, would say at the end of this. Something would be wrong if we went to all the trouble of being here, including for all of you on video, and nobody did anything. In other words, if you're working on a topic, whatever it is, in which people face diverse challenges, and you're administering a general purpose scale, grit, I'll do it, goal orientation, we know that you've just thrown out 2/3 or 3/4 of the available variance that you could pick up by simply running, you don't even have to say Kappa model if you don't want, by running individual assessments. And it's not that hard. Someone asked, and I'm sorry I didn't explicitly answer it, but how long does this take? If you have a relatively small set of items and everything's in Qualtrics and is zipping by, you know, in 20 minutes of assessment, you'll get some small version of this Kappa model stuff. And if you want, if you don't use this software, there's software within in the US, a readily available thing, Qualtrics, in which you can do the relevance rating task. People can slide a situation into a box or something and do their relevance ratings. Then the assessments don't take that long. It takes a while to draw these individual pictures. I won't go into too many details because I potentially would be advertising a company, but I'm part of a company that's trying to produce software that will just generate nice-looking Kappa model pictures, and unless everything crashes, that would be available within a matter of weeks. Or you could just write your own R code, as Walt, me, and, well, we just rely on a colleague of us, of course, to do all the work. Do that, and the R code can pluck out the text and the numbers and stick them all together and create the ideographic representations. It's not that hard to do, a heck of a lot better than handing out a generic grit learning orientation, one last time, or generalized self-efficacy scale. You could be often running, it's not quite a gigantic enterprise yet, but even, I'll admit it, even when I was surprised when sticking together these slides, that there's now actually a range of applications, and there'll be more in whatever happens, I guess lunch after this, when we see more of Professor Scott. So I'll stop after my 382 slides, and we'll leave the rest to Walt Scott for the afternoon.
I think we might have a question.
Oh, hooray! Oh, it's not from you.
It's not from me, it's from the sociologist around here.
Ah, you were here again today.
It's always me. Well, I'm going to try to put my ideas in a logical way. The first one, and because it's what you were saying now, if when I start to think about the Kappa, I saw it just like a model in a epistemologic way. But when you were talking, I start to see it something like a methodology to get in some data. So I would like to know, how do you see the Kappa? This is one question. The other, there is nothing about with this. The other is about at your 20 slide, I don't know. When you
slide 209.
When you were talking about self-schemata, are cognitive generalizations about the self derived from past experiences that organize and guide the processing of self-related information contained in the individual's social experiences. So,
that was very well phrased.
I copied. So, I am the sociologist. So, my question is, to do this self-schemata something better, even thinking in young people, like children and babies and young people, if we give to them better experiences in the sense that we think it's better, like I told you that I'm working with human rights, and you use the racism example with the engineer, and it seems to me that to change reality, to change society, we should provide better social experiences to someone, to persons that is forming their selves with the best social experiences. I don't know if it's too obvious, but it seems to me that the problematic experiences, bad experiences, or non-experience causes bad self-schemas, or not, I don't know if it's bad, but no value, without consistency, I don't know. It make a bad self-scheme makes the person insecure or afraid, or I don't know, whatever. And so I think that's it. And the other one, only one more, is when we categorize something, when we classify something, it seems to me that it's always relational. I'm lazy because I have a pattern that what laziness is. And I think, again, that it varies with the society and with the creation that we have at home, and how this impacts your Kappa model. So that's it. Enough.
Okay, for the first one,
and congrats! It's an amazing work.
Oh, I won't comment on that. Thanks. For the first one, I can't, because you've actually asked, in a sense, an autobiographical memory question, and I can't know if my answer was actually going to be accurate, because it's what was I thinking 25 years ago. I think things flow, if I use the long words of the philosopher, from the ontology. Because once you say, oh, I'm going to study these schemas, and unlike the social cognition studies that decide ahead of time, I'm going to study recklessness or independence. Once you say that, and then you say, I'm going to do it at a person level, there then is no reason to expect that the content of the schemas will have any consistency from one person to another. In other words, the additional ontological claim, oh, there will be 5 types of schemas, hardly seems to make sense, partly for the reason you said in your third question. It's not going to be the same schemas if the studies run in Sri Lanka, you know. So the only sensible it's implicit. thank you for asking that, because this was implicit. The only sensible ontological claim is that people observe their behavior. That has to be universal. I don't know what to say in the next one. Think of themselves one way or another as independent persons, even though the entire conception of self and what it is to be a self might vary culturally, but still have some concept of self. For some attributes, have it so much that it readily comes to mind and functions as a schema. But once you then try to take the next step, what are the types of schemas, that seemed crazy ontologically. Why would you think there's any types? Even though, mixing together your questions, that claim is made. So if you're in a, I'm sorry, it's in psychology and you're coming to this from a different field. But if you were in something called the study of attachment in children, the argument is that early relationships with parents that may vary create long-lasting schemas. Can I count on the parent or not? And then you learn something else. There's 3 kinds of that. Why there's only 3 kinds, I don't know. There's always a number of kinds that's less than 5. That study was started in the middle century, around the time where there would be 3 things, instead of the late 20th century where there's 5. So I simply didn't want to make any claims. The notion that there would be universe, so it's maybe, I don't know whether to call it a question of epistemology, or I really don't, as opposed to a question of ontology. But I could see no reason for making the claim that there existed in nature much more than what I put up. That then drives the methods. That then says it's sensible to ask people to describe themselves, but it's not sensible to create pre-existing categories. It's sensible to ask them to make these situational clusters, but you have to do it by putting in a universe of situations. The second one, obviously my experience in the US is not the African American experience. I know a number of you may have, but it's not the African American, but my understanding, including from people I know, is that parents may give their children what I've heard referred to as the talk. Well, you're going to have some experience where the person assumes you're less intelligent in school, or where the policeman pulls you over because you were driving 1 mile above the speed limit. This is going to happen. The way to interpret this situation is that there exists in society, I mean, I'm told that you explicitly tell the person you're living in a world in which every 2 weeks you're going to have an encounter in which people are pulled over because of their color of their skin, and you just, if you at least think that through ahead of time, then it creates a schema about the world being biased rather than one in which there might be something wrong with me. And I guess lots of things in psychology could be interpreted that way. Carol Dweck, I'm sorry, again, you're coming at this from, but as many other people will know in the room, there's a whole approach to education that in essence is the researcher Carol Dweck saying to the educator that you should teach children to interpret their successes as resulting from their efforts. And they should develop an effort schema so that when but she doesn't say that precisely. That might have been a simpler thing to say, wouldn't it? You don't have to run all the rest of the metaphysics, which, in case I'm sure Professor Dweck isn't watching. That isn't exactly what she says, but that would have been an easier thing to say. Well, if you reward people by saying, oh, good effort, you got an A, then they essentially develop an effort schema. That's probably the only thing you have to say, isn't it? And then when they fail the next test, when they were a little busy and hadn't fully prepared for it, they interpret their failure as a lack of effort. That's fine, because then they put forth more effort. If they live in a world in which, the irony is, at least in American education, that isn't how that works. I know somebody who runs a school in the town I live in who invited Carol Dweck to give a talk to the teachers to promote this effort thing, but the school, in order to attract children and get the parents to pay tuition, calls itself a school for gifted children. The complete irony, it's exactly what you're supposed to not do, because if you have a gifted children interpretation, then you fail the test, then you think you're not sufficiently gifted. If you applied efforts. So that, reading Carol Dweck's work extremely broadly, more so than she may even intend, is another kind of effort sorry for the same word, to get people to interpret a social world in a way that might be beneficial in the long run. And then there was the third, or did I? The third question was sort of the development of schemas question. I'm forgetting the nuance of that.
The better experiences would provide better schemas.
Right, that's it. So essentially, all those arguments are saying that it benefits from another layer of interpretation. And then they added the world of culture, yes. In which, of course, you may have variations in interpretations that you're learning from the social practices of your culture. So the answer is yes in general, but it depends on what the word experiences mean. If experiences mean the way you interpret those experiences, then the answer is yes, and then there are large-scale variations. I do some of the following work that I'll mention. I'm not going to put this up on screen. People will probably be ready for dinner at this point. But, for example, the nature of what it is to be at work and an employee at work varies considerably culturally. At work in the US, people are trying to promote themselves within a company and rise up in a company. And if you ask them, this study done with a colleague of mine from India, Ritu Tripathi, and if you ask, what motivates you at work, they say things like making more money and getting ahead at work. If you ask the same, if the people are from the United States, if the people are matched in some demographic way sample, except that they're from India, they say things like, benefit my community. My family will feel proud, and I will make the family proud. A whole bunch of things that no American says at all. So then their interpretation of a failure at work is, I've let down my community. Nobody says that in the United States. So there's entirely different interpretive frameworks. I won't say which is better, though there seems to be some advantage to the Indian one.
And you were talking about conflict. Imagine if we think about smaller communities, like, I don't know, women like Afro-descendants in Brazil, and women like Afro-descendants in the US. I think if the clusters...
Oh, yes, absolutely, right. Even those cultural comparisons, everyone knows this but doesn't. The field is starting to pay attention to this in case you think the psychologists are crazy. The field is starting to recognize that the cultural unit can't be Americans. That's almost ridiculous. There's a bunch of cultural psychology that compared Americans to Asians. Right, the categories were absurdly broad, but now everybody recognizes that. I won't do it now, but now there is literatures of subgroups who have, for example, different means of economic production within the same country in psychological ways. Well, I believe Anna Maciel will soon tell me that it's time for lunch.
It's time for lunch. Thank you very much for your words. Thank you for the question. For those of you who are online, we'll be back by 2:15, right? And please, a warm round of applause to Professor Cervone.
Thank you.